The recruits had heard whispers long before she ever stepped into their lives. Rumors moved like smoke through the barracks, carried on laughter and bravado, dismissed just as quickly as they were spoken. "Some old lady's gonna evaluate us," one of them scoffed. "Must be some admin type, checking boxes." Another added, "Maybe a nurse. Or some officer's wife they're humoring." The four of them, Carter, a brash football player turned Marine hopeful, Diaz, sharp-eyed and quick with jokes, Mason, tall and heavy with muscle but slow to think before acting, and Riley, the youngest, barely out of high school, were united by a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They had survived boot camp, endured weeks of grueling drills, and thought they knew the measure of hardship. When they heard a civilian woman was coming to oversee a new form of training exercise, they didn't bat an eye. In their minds they'd handle it the way they handled everything, with swagger, laughter and maybe a touch of disrespect. What harm could a woman in her 40s possibly bring? That illusion broke the moment she walked into the training yard. No uniform, no insignia, no medals. Just plain cargo pants, a fitted black t-shirt, and boots that looked like they'd traveled across more countries than the recruits could name. Her hair was tied back in a no-nonsense knot streaked with silver, her face lined not by age but by experiences that had carved a quiet steel into her expression. She didn't carry a clipboard or even a sidearm. Her hands were empty, loose at her sides, but her presence was louder than any sergeant's bark. The air itself seemed to shift when she stopped in front of the four recruits, her gaze sweeping over them like a weight they suddenly didn't know how to carry. Carter smirked at Mason, trying to lighten the strange tension. But the smirk died when her eyes landed on him, gray eyes, sharp and unblinking, the kind that looked right through flesh and bone, searching for weakness. "Names?" she said simply. No greeting, no rank offered. Just one word, low and steady like a drumbeat. One by one they stammered out their surnames, their voices unsure for the first time in weeks. She didn't nod, didn't acknowledge. She just stared until each of them had spoken, and then turned away, motioning with a flick of her wrist for them to follow. They obeyed, though none of them wanted to admit they didn't quite know why. Something about her walk, the quiet precision, the way her shoulders never slumped, the sense of absolute control in every step, made them fall into line without realizing. The yard led to an obstacle course, one they'd run a dozen times before. Walls to climb, rope nets to scale, pits of mud to crawl through. They grinned at one another, already anticipating how quickly they'd crush it, how they'd show this simple woman what young blood could do. But instead of giving a speech, instead of ordering them to start, she stepped forward herself. And then, with a casualness that bordered on insulting, she ran the entire course at a pace they could barely believe. No hesitation, no wasted movement. She scaled the wall like it was a ladder rung, rolled over the top, landed without a sound. Her hands gripped ropes with a practiced snap, her body weaving through mud as though she were water cutting through a stream. By the time she reached the finish, she wasn't even breathing hard. She didn't smile or taunt. She simply turned and said, "Your turn." The four of them burst forward, pride burning hotter than caution. Carter took the lead, muscles pumping, but halfway up the wall he slipped, splattering into the dirt with a grunt. Diaz laughed until his own handhold snapped, sending him sliding back down. Mason powered through, but by the third obstacle his strength slowed him, his movements clumsy compared to her sleek efficiency. Riley, the youngest, pushed hardest, desperate to impress, but his lungs betrayed him before he hit the final stretch. One by one they stumbled across the finish, drenched in sweat, covered in mud, breathing like bellows. She watched them without a flicker of emotion, her face unreadable. When Carter opened his mouth to explain, something about a bad grip, about the rope being slick, she raised one hand. Silence fell like a guillotine. "You think this is a test of strength," she said quietly. "It's not. It's a test of discipline, of awareness, of control. Anyone can thrash their way through mud. That doesn't make you dangerous. That makes you predictable. Predictable men die first." Her words hit harder than any drill sergeant's bark, cutting through bravado like knives. None of them responded. They only stood there, chest heaving, sweat dripping, eyes avoiding hers. For the first time the thought surfaced, maybe this wasn't going to be easy. Maybe she wasn't who they thought she was. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't instructions but an order that left their throats dry. "Follow." No explanation, no destination given. They followed anyway, pulled not by obligation but by something heavier, an unspoken knowledge that beneath her plain clothes, her quiet voice, her unassuming presence, there was something far greater. And though none of them would admit it, A tremor of fear rippled beneath their bones as they realized this wasn't going to be another training day. This was going to be a revelation. The recruits trailed after her in silence, their boots crunching against gravel as the late afternoon sun dipped lower over the training compound. None of them dared ask where she was taking them. Questions seemed almost childish under her watchful pace, and for once Carter, always the loudest voice, kept his mouth shut. She led them beyond the familiar yard, past the shooting ranges, even past the barracks, until the compound gave way to a stretch of dense woods. The air shifted there, cooler and heavier, filled with the smell of pine and earth. Riley swallowed hard, glancing sideways at Mason, who towered like a silent shadow. Even Mason looked unsettled. It wasn't the woods themselves, they had hiked through worse during field training, it was the sense of purpose in her stride, like she was leading them not just into trees but into a world where their rules no longer applied. Finally, she stopped in a clearing where the ground was littered with leaves and the remnants of old fire pits. Without a word, she crouched, pulled a knife from somewhere none of them had noticed, and drew a circle in the dirt. The blade gleamed once before disappearing back into its sheath, the motion so swift and natural it left their eyes scrambling to follow. She pointed to the circle. "This," she said, "is where you live. This is your safe space. Step outside of it without thinking, without preparation, and you're exposed. Vulnerable. Dead." The recruits shifted uncomfortably. It was strange. She wasn't yelling, wasn't humiliating them like drill instructors had, but the weight of her calmness pressed heavier than any roar. "Now," she continued, "you're going to learn how to stay alive outside the circle." She pointed to Diaz. "You. Out." Diaz hesitated, forcing a grin, trying to shake off the unease. "Sure," he said, stepping forward, shoulders squared. He expected some lecture, maybe a simple demonstration. What he didn't expect was the blur of movement. She lunged, her body folding low, then springing upward like a coil released. In the space of a blink, she had his arm twisted, his knees buckled, and his back pressed to the ground. The air rushed from his lungs in a wheeze. The others froze, eyes wide. She released Diaz as quickly as she had taken him down, straightening without a single breath out of rhythm. Diaz staggered to his feet, rubbing his shoulder, cheeks burning red. Mason opened his mouth to laugh, but the look she gave him made the sound die in his throat. "Lesson 1, she said. "Speed isn't about muscles. It's about knowing where to strike and when to move. Strength without timing is nothing." She turned to Mason then. "Your turn." Mason stepped out, towering over her, confidence puffing his chest. "All right," he muttered, "let's see what you got." He swung, a clumsy attempt to grab her, and for a heartbeat it looked as though his sheer size might give him the edge. But she slid under his arm, spun, and drove her elbow into his back. He hit the dirt harder than Diaz had, the impact rattling his bones. Before he could rise, she had him pinned, one knee pressing into his spine, his wrist twisted back at an angle that promised pain but not injury. Her voice was steady above him. "Lesson 2, size makes you slower. Slower means predictable. Predictable means dead." By the time she let him go, the bravado had drained from his face. Riley shifted nervously, knowing he was next. His stomach clenched, but he stepped forward anyway, too proud to back out. She studied him for a long second before nodding once. "Come." He tried to be smart, circling her, waiting for her to make the first move. But she didn't move. She just stood there, eyes tracking his every twitch, and the longer the silence stretched, the more his nerves frayed. Finally, desperate, he lunged. She sidestepped, hooked his ankle, and sent him sprawling. He scrambled up, attacked again, and again she flowed around him, guiding his momentum into the dirt. By the third fall, his chest heaved with exhaustion and frustration. She crouched near him, her voice low enough that only he heard. "Lesson 3, patience. If you let desperation decide your moves, you're already lost." Carter stepped into the circle last. Unlike the others, his grin had returned. He was the athlete, the fighter, the one who never backed down from competition. "You're good," he said, rolling his shoulders, "but I've gone toe-to-toe with guys twice my size. You won't drop me that easy." He lunged with surprising speed, his football instincts kicking in as he tried to tackle her low. For a heartbeat, it almost looked like he'd caught her. But she twisted, used his momentum against him, and within seconds he was flat on his back, staring up at the canopy of trees with her knee lightly pressing against his ribs. Not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to prove she could. She stood, leaving him sprawled there, and faced all 4 of them. "You think war is about brawn? About who shouts the loudest or who lifts the heaviest? It isn't. War is about silence. It's about being invisible until the moment you strike. It's about ending a fight before it begins." Her eyes swept across their faces, catching the mixture of shame, anger, and dawning respect. Then, with a voice that cut like steel, she said, "You thought I was just a simple woman. But I was forged in places you can't imagine. I was a SEAL before any of you knew how to spell the word discipline." The words hit like thunder. A SEAL. The realization sank in slow, heavy waves. They had just been thrown to the ground, one, by someone who had once belonged to the most elite, secretive, and lethal fighting force in the world. And suddenly, all 4 recruits understood. They weren't here to impress her. They were here to survive her. Night had fallen by the time they made their way back to the compound. The walk was long, silent, and heavy with thoughts none of them wanted to share. The air buzzed with crickets, the stars blanketing the sky above, but for the 4 recruits, the only thing pressing into their minds was her words, "I was a SEAL." They replayed the fights in their heads, every stumble, every second they had been outmaneuvered, the speed with which she had dismantled them. None of it felt real. SEALs were legends, the kind of figures you heard about in hushed tones, the ghosts that operated where no one else could. The idea that this woman, who looked plain at a glance, had been one of them shook their understanding of everything. Carter tried to laugh once, muttering, "Hell, maybe she's just messing with us." But no one joined in. Even he didn't believe his own words. When they returned to the yard, she gave no indication of fatigue. She moved with the same calm steadiness, as though the hours in the woods hadn't even touched her. The recruits, however, were bone-tired. Sweat clung to their clothes, their muscles screamed from exertion, and their pride was bruised worse than their bodies. She stopped near the edge of the yard, turned to them, and with that same piercing gaze said, "You've all been trained to follow orders. To march when told. To shout when told. To push yourselves when someone else screams in your face. That's easy. A soldier who only functions under command is a puppet, not a fighter." She took a step closer, her voice dropping lower, quieter, and somehow even more dangerous. "What happens when there is no voice to follow? When you are dropped into a world where every sound you make can cost you your life? When there is no one left to tell you move now, fire now, breathe now? Then it is you, alone, against chaos. That is where real warriors are born." She let the words sink in before motioning toward the barracks. "Tomorrow at dawn you'll learn what silence feels like. Get some rest. You'll need it." The recruits didn't argue. They trudged back into the barracks, collapsing onto bunks with the kind of exhaustion that clawed deep. But sleep didn't come easy. Carter tossed and turned, jaw tight, replaying the moment she dropped him into the dirt. Diaz stared at the ceiling, mind racing with the realization that his jokes and quick tongue meant nothing against someone like her. Mason rubbed his sore wrist, frustration burning his pride. Riley, the youngest, lay with wide eyes, the image of her steel-gray stare etched into his thoughts. For the first time since training began, none of them felt invincible. When dawn broke, she was waiting for them in the yard. They shuffled out, stiff and bleary, only to find her standing at ease, her arms crossed as if she had been there for hours already. Without a word, she led them toward the woods again, though this time the path veered deeper, into denser trees where the sunlight barely filtered through. The forest swallowed sound, muffling their footsteps, making every snap of a twig echo like a gunshot. Finally she stopped, turning to face them with that same unreadable expression. "Today," she said softly, "you will not speak. Not a word. Not a whisper. Your mission is to move through this forest, reach the ridge 2 miles out, and return here. But there's a catch." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "I'll be hunting you." The recruits stiffened, eyes darting toward one another. Hunt them? The word itself seemed absurd, almost laughable, except none of them laughed. They had seen what she was capable of in the clearing, how quickly she had dismantled each of them without effort. If she was serious, and they knew she was, then this was no simple exercise. This was something else entirely. Carter finally tried to lighten the mood with a half-smile. "What, like hide and seek?" Her eyes locked onto his, and she said in that calm, deadly voice, "If I find you, you won't walk away untouched." A shiver ran down his spine, and his grin vanished. She gave them one final look, then stepped back into the shadows of the trees. And just like that she was gone. No sound of footsteps, no rustle of branches. 1 second she stood before them, the next she was swallowed by the forest as though she had never been there. The recruits exchanged uneasy glances. Diaz whispered, "We stick together, right?" But Riley shook his head, his voice low, almost trembling. She said no words. The realization hit, she could be anywhere, listening, watching. One mistake, one slip, and she would be on them. They started moving, nerves jangling with every step. The forest seemed alive in a way it hadn't the day before. Every bird call felt like a signal, every crack of branches a warning. Mason tried to lead, his size making him push through the brush, but the noise he created drew sharp looks from the others. Carter hissed at him with gestures trying to get him to slow down. Diaz tried to crack a smile, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching them from somewhere unseen. They trudged forward, careful, cautious, but no matter how quiet they tried to be, the forest betrayed them. Snapping twigs, crunching leaves, the heavy sound of boots pressing into earth. An hour passed, their nerves stretched thin. Just when they started to believe they might actually make it, she appeared. Not with noise. Not with warning. 1 second the path ahead was empty, the next she dropped from a tree branch, landing silently in front of them. Before they could react, she flicked her wrist and Carter's legs were swept out from under him. He hit the dirt, groaning. The others froze, eyes wide as she stood there, calm as ever. "Too loud," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Then, without another word, she vanished back into the trees, leaving them shaken and sweating. That was when it sank in. This wasn't a game. This was survival, and she was the predator. Carter scrambled back to his feet, brushing dirt from his fatigues, his face flushed with humiliation. He wanted to curse, to yell, but no sound left his mouth. Her rule of silence had gripped them too tightly. The other 3 recruits just stared, wide-eyed, still processing how effortlessly she had appeared and disappeared, as though she belonged to the forest itself. The trees around them no longer seemed like cover. They felt like walls closing in, concealing an enemy who could strike from any angle. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of shadows now carried menace. Riley's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his pack straps. Diaz looked around nervously, his usual smirk gone, his jaw clenched. Even Mason, who had always leaned on brute force, swallowed hard as sweat trickled down his neck. They had trained for ambushes before, but never like this. In the back of all their minds, a question pulsed like a drumbeat. If she had been an enemy, how many times would we already be dead? They pressed forward again, but their pace slowed, every step more cautious. Mason tried to lead, but the weight of silence bore down on him, his footsteps sounding too loud, too clumsy. Diaz tugged his sleeve and pointed toward a less beaten path, motioning for them to shift direction. Carter resisted at first, pride urging him to keep control, but Riley gave him a look that said it plainly, "She's out there watching." Reluctantly, Carter nodded, letting Diaz take the lead. They moved like shadows, or at least tried to, hugging the thicker brush, lowering themselves to avoid open gaps between the trees. Their breaths came shallow, lungs burning with the effort to stay quiet. For a long stretch there was nothing. Just the chirp of insects, the whisper of leaves in the wind. It was almost worse than an attack, the waiting gnawing at their nerves. Carter's eyes darted to every movement, seeing threats in every shifting branch. Mason's hand twitched toward his knife, though there was nothing to fight but the silence itself. When Diaz glanced back at them, his expression carried the strain, lips pressed tight, sweat darkening his collar. They were unraveling slowly, the forest and her unseen presence chewing at their confidence. Then, without warning, it happened again. She didn't come from the front this time. She didn't drop from a tree. Instead, a blur shot from the underbrush to Mason's right. Before he even knew she was there, his arm was locked behind his back, his massive frame wrenched to the ground with such precision it looked effortless. She pressed a hand to the back of his neck, pinning him, her voice soft and calm as though she were explaining the weather. "You're looking forward, not around. Forward is a soldier. Around is survival." Then, just as before, she vanished back into the woods, leaving Mason grunting in the dirt, his pride cracked wider than before. The recruits pulled him up quickly, their faces pale. None of them dared speak, but in their silence they communicated volumes. Carter's jaw tightened. He wanted to rage at how easily she kept cutting them down. Diaz's eyes darted toward the shadows, his confidence breaking further with every appearance. Riley, younger but sharper than the rest, was beginning to see the truth behind her lessons. She wasn't just testing their strength or their speed. She was teaching them how small they were in the eyes of a real predator. The ridge felt impossibly far. 2 miles had never seemed like such a vast expanse, and every step forward felt like they were being funneled deeper into her trap. Carter signaled for them to spread out, trying to cover more ground and avoid another ambush, but it backfired. The moment Diaz drifted just a few steps out of reach, she struck again. This time she didn't knock him down. She appeared behind him, one arm wrapping around his neck in a chokehold that came and went before the others could blink. She whispered in his ear, her words low but sharp enough that the others could hear, "Alone is death." And then she let him go, disappearing once more into the maze of trees. Diaz staggered back toward them, his face pale, his chest heaving. They regrouped quickly, this time sticking closer together, understanding now that splitting apart only made them easier prey. Their bodies ached from the tension of being hunted, their minds fraying with each encounter. Carter clenched his fists, seething silently, while Mason trudged with less fire than before, humbled and rattled. Diaz kept glancing over his shoulder, flinching at every sound. Riley, however, kept his eyes moving, not just forward but to the sides, the canopy, the ground, trying to think the way she did. Another hour crawled by. They moved slower now, deliberate, stopping at intervals to listen, scanning every angle. But the truth settled heavier with every step. No matter how cautious they were, she was better. She had already proved it. The forest was her home and they were intruders stumbling through it. When they finally reached the ridge, a jagged rise of rock overlooking a valley, they collapsed in exhaustion, not from the hike but from the constant dread of her sudden appearances. Carter slumped against a boulder, glaring into the trees. "This is," he started to whisper but caught himself just in time, clamping his mouth shut. The rule of silence still held them like chains. They waited there, unsure what to do next. Had they completed the mission? Would she emerge and tell them it was over? Or was she waiting for them to make the mistake of letting their guard down? The stillness of the ridge felt deceptive, like the calm before a strike. Their breaths came ragged, sweat plastering their fatigues to their skin, eyes scanning every shadow. And then, as if on cue, she appeared again, not with violence but with quiet steps, walking toward them from the treeline as though she had been there all along. Her face was unreadable, her movements fluid, precise. She stopped a few feet away, hands clasped loosely behind her back. For a long moment, she said nothing, only studied them with those steel-gray eyes that seemed to measure not their bodies, but their spirits. Finally, she spoke, "You are beginning to understand." Her words hung in the air like a verdict. "You are beginning to understand." The recruits exchanged uneasy glances, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt, their bodies aching from the relentless tension of being hunted. But something in her tone made it clear that whatever they had endured so far was only the beginning. She turned her back to them and began walking along the ridge path, not checking to see if they followed. And yet, as if tethered by an invisible line, they rose to their feet and trailed after her. There was no discussion, no hesitation. Her authority didn't need rank or insignia, it was carved into the way she moved, the way the world itself seemed to bend around her presence. She led them deeper into the forest, beyond the ridge, until the ground sloped downward into a gully choked with thick brush. The air there was damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and moss. She stopped abruptly and pointed to the far side of the ravine, where the trees thinned into a clearing. "Out there," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "You'll cross this ground without being seen. Not by me. Not by anyone." Carter frowned, glancing around. "There's no cover," he muttered instinctively, then immediately regretted speaking. She didn't glare or shout, she simply looked at him and he felt the weight of his mistake crush him. "You use what you have," she replied coldly. "If there is no cover, you make cover. If there is no path, you create one. Excuses are what you leave behind with your body bag." The challenge was clear. They would have to cross open terrain while she stalked them. The recruits crouched low, exchanging nervous looks. Mason whispered hoarsely, "She can't watch all of us at once." Diaz shook his head quickly, eyes wide. "Don't. She'll hear you." Riley was the first to move. He pressed himself against the mud of the gully wall, inching forward carefully, using every shadow he could find. The others followed, clumsy at first, their boots dragging against roots, their breathing too loud. They were trying to be silent, but compared to her effortless vanishing, their attempts felt like children hiding under blankets. Halfway across, Carter made the mistake of moving too fast. His pride drove him to prove he could outpace her watch, that strength and boldness mattered more than patience. He darted forward, ignoring the quiet gestures from Diaz and Riley. For a moment it looked like he might make it. Then a shadow dropped from above. She landed behind him, swept his legs out, and pressed the flat of a knife against his throat before he even realized she was there. He froze, eyes wide, chest heaving. "Dead," she said softly before slipping back into the trees, gone again. The other three froze in place, their hearts pounding. Carter rejoined them, his pride stinging worse than the dirt on his clothes, his expression twisted with frustration. But none of them mocked him, no one dared. They pressed on more carefully now, inching their way forward, every sense on edge. Riley took the lead again, his young eyes scanning constantly, forcing himself to move slow, deliberate, fighting against the instinct to rush. Mason stayed low, his large frame awkward but trying, while Diaz muttered prayers in his head, his usual humor long since stripped away. Minutes stretched like hours, each step a gamble, each sound amplified in their ears. Then, when they were within sight of the clearing, she struck again. This time it was Mason. His size betrayed him. His foot snapped a branch, and before he could react, she was on him, spinning him down into the mud with a twist of his arm. He hit the ground with a grunt, teeth grinding in humiliation. She crouched over him just long enough to whisper, "Strength makes you a target," before melting back into the brush. Mason rose slowly, his face pale beneath the sweat and grime. Finally, breathless and drained, they stumbled into the clearing. They collapsed to their knees, shoulders slumped, their bodies trembling with exertion. She emerged from the shadows moments later, walking into the clearing with no sign of fatigue, as if the hunt hadn't touched her at all. Her gaze swept across them, sharp and unyielding. "You are slow," she said. "You are loud. You rely on what you think you are, strong, fast, clever. None of it matters if the enemy is already watching you." She paused, letting her words sink into their raw exhaustion. Then she added, her voice cutting like a blade, "And the enemy is always watching you." Her stare lingered on each of them in turn. Carter's clenched fists, Diaz's trembling hands, Mason's lowered head, Riley's wide eyes, they all carried the same truth now. She was showing them how vulnerable they really were, stripping away every illusion of control. And beneath that harshness, they could see the faintest glimmer of her intent. She wasn't just humiliating them. She was breaking them down, piece by piece, so something new could be built in their place. She turned her back to them again, gesturing for them to rise. "We are not finished. You will learn or you will fail. And failure is death." Her words echoed in the clearing, cold and absolute. And as the 4 recruits stumbled to their feet, following her into the trees once more, a grim realization tightened in their chests. They had come here thinking she was just a simple woman. Now they were beginning to understand. She was a storm, and they were nothing but leaves trying to survive it. The forest swallowed them again, but this time the weight pressing down on the recruits wasn't just exhaustion or fear, it was the creeping realization that every step forward was another chance for her to expose them. She moved ahead without noise, her silhouette barely visible in the shifting light of the trees. The 4 followed, beaten down but unwilling to stop. Pride, once the fire that had fueled them, had turned into something colder, something closer to desperation. They no longer thought about proving themselves, they thought about enduring, about surviving her gaze for just a little longer. Carter, once full of swagger, now kept his eyes glued to the ground, jaw tight. Mason's massive frame sagged with fatigue, each movement heavy and deliberate. Diaz, usually quick with a joke, hadn't spoken, or even dared to smirk, in hours. Riley, the youngest, moved with an anxious sharpness, scanning every shadow, his mind replaying her words like a mantra. "The enemy is always watching." They reached another clearing, this one wider and ringed with jagged rocks. She stopped in the center, waiting for them to gather. Her voice carried easily in the still air. "You've learned what it means to be hunted. Now you'll learn what it means to fight with nothing." She tossed a bundle onto the ground. Inside were 4 lengths of rope, a few sticks and a handful of dull metal scraps. No knives, no firearms, nothing sharp enough to do damage. Carter frowned, wiping sweat from his brow. Mason muttered under his breath, shaking his head. But none of them dared protest aloud. They knew better by now. She crouched down, picking up one of the sticks and holding it lightly between her fingers. "Your enemies will never fight you on your terms. They will never give you fair ground. They will take your weapons, your strength, your confidence. And when you are stripped bare, what you do next decides whether you live or die." With that, she stood, tossing the stick back into the pile. "Build weapons. Build traps. Defend yourselves. You have 30 minutes. Then she stepped back into the shadows of the trees, her presence vanishing like smoke. The 4 of them looked at the pile, then at each other. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant call of a bird. Finally, Riley knelt down and picked up the rope, his hands trembling but determined. We should make something fast," he whispered, barely audible. Carter gave a sharp look, then realized no one was going to report him for speaking. The silence rule seemed to apply only when she was near. "Fine," Carter muttered. "We'll split it. Mason, you tie up a club with that stick. Diaz, see if you can sharpen one of those scraps against the rocks. Riley, help me with this rope, we can rig a snare or something." They worked quickly, sweat dripping into their eyes, hands fumbling with the rough materials. Mason grunted as he swung the stick against the ground, trying to break it into a usable length. Diaz hunched over a rock, scraping metal against stone, sparks occasionally flashing. Riley knotted rope with trembling fingers, while Carter tried to direct with what little confidence he had left. But time slipped away faster than they expected. 30 minutes felt like 10, and before they had anything solid, she emerged again. She stepped into the clearing without a sound, eyes falling immediately on their crude creations. A stick bound with fraying rope. A shard of dull metal that barely cut through bark. A half-finished snare that sagged against the ground. She crouched to examine them, her face unreadable. Then she stood, her voice calm but merciless. These would buy you seconds. Maybe. Her gaze cut into them one by one. Seconds are not survival. Seconds are a grave you dig slower. Before they could react, she moved. She snatched Mason's makeshift club, spun it in her hand and brought it down across his arm, not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough to send him sprawling with a cry of pain. She caught Diaz's metal shard mid-swing and twisted it from his hand, flipping him into the dirt in one smooth motion. Carter lunged with the rope snare, but she caught it, yanked him forward and slammed him to his knees. Riley froze, holding the last scrap of rope, his chest heaving. She stepped toward him slowly, deliberately, until the rope slipped from his hands. You see, she said, standing tall above them. You think in minutes? I think in hours. You think in weapons? I think in the silence before the strike. That is why I survive. She stepped back, letting them pull themselves up, their bodies aching, their pride shredded. Mason rubbed his arm, glaring at the ground. Diaz spat dirt from his mouth, shame etched into his face. Carter clenched his fists, fury burning behind his eyes, but he said nothing. Riley, however, stood straighter, his breathing uneven but his gaze locked on her. There was something shifting in him, something the others hadn't found yet, a willingness to learn even if it meant being broken apart. She noticed it. Her eyes lingered on Riley a second longer before she turned to all of them. Tomorrow the test ends. You will either walk away having learned what it means to fight in silence, or you will crawl away knowing you were never ready. With that, she vanished again, swallowed by the trees, leaving them trembling in the clearing with nothing but their failure and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, they could still rise to her challenge. For the first time since it began, the four recruits didn't look at each other with arrogance or banter. They looked at each other with something heavier, something closer to fear, and beneath it, the first flickers of respect. Not just for her, but for what she was trying to force into their bones. The night before the final test was unlike any other they had endured. The forest, usually alive with insects and the distant rustle of animals, seemed unnaturally still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. The recruits sat in a rough circle, their backs against rocks and fallen logs, their makeshift weapons discarded nearby. None of them had the strength for bravado anymore. Mason's arm still ached from the blow she had delivered, his thick frame hunched forward as he rubbed the sore spot absent-mindedly. Diaz, usually restless, was silent, his eyes fixed on the dirt as though the ground itself might give him answers. Carter kept fidgeting, tapping his foot, chewing at his lip, every muscle screaming for release but bound by exhaustion and something deeper, fear of what tomorrow would bring. And Riley, the youngest, stared into the darkness with a strange calm, his mind replaying her words again and again. Tomorrow the test ends. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Carter broke the silence, his voice low and strained. We've been through hell already. What more can she throw at us? The question hung heavy in the air. Mason gave a bitter laugh, short and humorless. You think this was hell? Hell hasn't even started yet. His tone wasn't mocking, it was flat, almost resigned. Diaz rubbed the back of his neck, then finally looked up. She's not doing this for fun. There's a reason. SEALs don't waste time. Every second out here is teaching us something, even if we don't see it yet. Carter shot him a look but didn't argue. For once, there was no spark in his eyes. Riley finally spoke, his voice steadier than expected. She's showing us what we don't want to see, that it's not about us. It's about what comes after. Who's standing when no one else is. The others glanced at him, surprised by the conviction in his tone, but before anyone could respond, the sound of branches snapping cut through the air. Instinctively, they reached for their crude weapons, but a figure emerged from the treeline, moving with the same effortless silence that had haunted their every step. She stepped into the faint moonlight, her face unreadable. You're awake. Good. She scanned the circle, her eyes sharp, weighing their exhaustion, their fear, and the faint embers of determination that still lingered. Tomorrow you will face your final test. But understand this, tomorrow isn't about fighting me. Tomorrow is about fighting yourselves. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. She simply turned and walked back into the forest, leaving them with those words burning in their minds. When dawn broke, the air was heavy with mist, curling between the trees in pale ribbons. They followed her silently to another clearing, this one larger, the ground uneven and littered with roots and stones. She stood in the center, her posture unyielding, her presence commanding. "Today," she said, her voice carrying over the damp air, "you will fight as a unit. Not against me. Against the forest, against time, against yourselves. I will give you one mission: reach the ridge on the far side before sundown. Fail and you walk away knowing you were never ready. Succeed, and you may just begin to understand what it means to endure." She handed them a small map, nothing more than rough lines marking the terrain. No weapons, no food, no compass. Just their bodies, their minds, and the bruises that covered them. Mason clenched his fists, his jaw tight. Carter let out a shaky breath, staring at the map like it might burst into flames. Diaz adjusted his stance, a flicker of determination flashing in his eyes. And Riley, though pale with exhaustion, nodded once as if to himself. The moment they began, the forest turned against them. The terrain was brutal, steep slopes slick with mud, thickets of thorny undergrowth that tore at their clothes, streams swollen with rainwater forcing them to wade waist-deep through freezing currents. The sun was hidden behind the mist, giving them no sense of time. Every step was agony, their bodies screaming for rest, but the thought of her watching, somewhere unseen, kept them moving. They didn't speak much. Breath was too precious, and words seemed to weigh more than silence. But as the hours dragged on, something shifted. Mason, who had once mocked the others for their weakness, started lifting branches out of their way without being asked. Carter, whose ego had been a wall between him and everyone else, offered his hand when Diaz slipped on a slick stone. Diaz, who had carried himself with restless impatience, steadied Riley when the younger recruit's knees nearly gave out. And Riley, who had seemed like the weakest, was the one who whispered reminders to keep going, his quiet determination a lifeline none of them had expected. The ridge loomed in the distance, jagged and unforgiving, its slopes shrouded in fog. Reaching it would require every ounce of strength they had left. They stumbled, crawled, and dragged themselves upward, fingers bleeding, lungs burning. Carter cursed under his breath, Mason growled with every heave, Diaz clenched his teeth so hard his jaw ached, but none of them stopped. They didn't need her words anymore. The forest, the pain, and the silence had carved the lesson into them. Survival wasn't about who was the strongest or the loudest or the toughest. It was about refusing to quit when everything told you to fall. When they finally reached the top, the sun was sinking, bleeding orange across the horizon. They collapsed together on the rocky ground, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. For a long time none of them spoke. Then a voice came from behind them, calm and steady. "You made it." She stepped into view, her figure silhouetted against the dying light. For once there was no challenge in her tone, no edge of mockery or test. There was something else, something the recruits hadn't seen before. Approval. "You learned what it means to fight yourselves. You learned what it means to move as one. And now, you've earned something no one can take from you, the knowledge that you can endure." Her gaze swept over each of them, pausing just long enough to let her words sink in. "But tomorrow, you will face the truth of what it means to be SEALs." And with that she turned away, leaving them battered, broken, and staring at the horizon with a mixture of dread and hope for the trial yet to come. The recruits barely slept that night. Their bodies were wrecked, every bruise and scrape burning in the cold air, but it wasn't pain that kept them awake, it was anticipation. Tomorrow she had promised they would face the truth of what it meant to be SEALs. Each of them lay staring at the shadows, wondering what more could possibly be demanded after everything they had endured. Mason kept shifting, muttering under his breath like he was arguing with himself. Diaz sat cross-legged, his eyes closed as though meditating. Carter chewed at his knuckles, restless as ever, while Riley simply lay still, his chest rising and falling with slow breaths, as though conserving every ounce of energy for whatever came next. When dawn came, she appeared again, moving through the mist as though the forest itself bowed to her presence. She carried nothing, not a weapon, not a map, not even the cold glares they had grown used to. Instead, her face was calm, unreadable. She stopped in front of them and spoke in a voice that carried more weight than any shout. "Today is not about reaching a ridge. Today is not about fighting me. Today you face the truth." She gestured toward the treeline. "Follow." The march was silent. The forest was damp and gray, the air heavy with the smell of earth and moss. For the first time since they'd arrived, None of them looked at the ground or cursed under their breath. They looked ahead, eyes locked on her back, sensing that whatever waited at the end of this walk would either break them or define them. They emerged into a wide clearing where a single table sat beneath the twisted arms of an oak tree. On it lay 5 envelopes, worn and sealed. She stepped behind the table, her hands resting lightly on the wood. "Inside these envelopes," she said, "are letters. They were written before you came here. Some by your families. Some by people you've lost. Some by yourselves, reminders of who you thought you were when this began." A flicker of confusion crossed their faces. Mason frowned, Diaz tilted his head, Carter's foot twitched, Riley's eyes narrowed. She didn't give them time to speak. "Your final test is not physical. It is not about endurance. It is about choice. You can open these letters, or you can walk away without ever knowing what's inside." They stared at the envelopes like they were bombs waiting to go off. She continued, her voice sharper now. "Being a SEAL is not about strength or toughness. It's about living with ghosts. It's about carrying every failure, every loss, every doubt, and still moving forward. These letters represent the weight you'll carry if you choose this path. If you can't face what's inside, then you don't belong here." Mason's massive hands trembled as he reached for his envelope. His thick fingers struggled with the seal, but when he finally tore it open, his eyes scanned the page and his jaw tightened. His father's handwriting. A man who had never once said he was proud of him. But here, in uneven script, were words Mason had waited his whole life to hear. "I never said it, but I see you now. Don't stop." Mason's lips pressed into a line. He folded the letter carefully and set it against his chest, as though anchoring it to his heart. Diaz ripped his envelope open with impatient hands. Inside was a note he had written to himself months ago, back when training had just begun. The words were cocky, arrogant, dripping with overconfidence. "You're unstoppable. You'll crush this." He read it once, then again, and then shook his head with a humorless laugh. "I was a damn fool," he muttered, crumpling the paper in his fist. "But I'm not that guy anymore." Carter hesitated. His fingers hovered, then drew back, then hovered again. He swallowed hard and finally opened it. His younger sister's handwriting stared back at him. She had written before going into surgery he hadn't been there for, begging him to make it count, to become the man he promised he would be. Carter's chest heaved, his face twisting. For once there was no swagger, no arrogance, just raw grief and a desperate resolve. "I can't quit now," he whispered.